Hi, everybody. This is Jasmine McAdams. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to give everybody a couple more minutes to get logged in, and then we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jasmine McAdams, Program Officer for NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. Thank you for joining us today for the Electric Vehicle State Working Group webinar and peer sharing call. Today, we are looking forward to discussing regional coordination of transportation electrification, and we'll be joined by four awesome speakers who will be discussing efforts in various regions of the country. We have first Cassie Powers from the National Association of State Energy Officials, Kathy Kinsey from the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management, Brendan Jordan from the Great Plains Institute, and Jennifer Weiss from Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment. But before we get started, we will be taking a few minutes to go over roll call and then get into some of the presentations. So, Danielle.
Great, welcome everyone. This is Danielle Sass-Burnett with NARUC. We'll do a quick reading of the list of who's on the line and invite folks to raise their hand at any time if you'd like to speak up. And of course, once we conclude the webinar presentations and we move into our peer discussion, we will unmute everyone's lines. So long time in advance, but please use your local mute button. On the line today, we have Al Freeman from Michigan, Alejandro Axela from Illinois, Amanda Best from Maryland, Andrew Rector from Washington, Chairman Carrie Zaleski from Illinois, Drew McAuliffe from Maryland, Andrea Fraser from DC, Connor Terwilliger from Minnesota, Jamie Barber from Georgia, Joe Fontaine from Wisconsin, Joy Wang from Michigan, Karen Gould from Michigan, Karen Oleski from Nevada, Kristen Abbott from Texas, Lindsay Weiner from New York, Sam Watson from North Carolina, Shannon Wissenshaw from Michigan, and of course, we're joined by our Chair and Vice Chair, Commissioner Bocanegra and Commissioner Stanek. Thank you all for being with us here today. We look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Danielle. And before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that you're welcome to ask any questions throughout the presentations. However, today, Cassie Powers will be leaving at about 3:15. So if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat in the question section of the bar on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will go ahead and forward those to Cassie for her to follow up with you afterwards. All right, so Cassie, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. This is Cassie Powers with NASEO. I'm very pleased to be here to share a little information about Rev West. And if you could go to the next slide, please. I think that most folks on the phone are familiar with NASEO. We are the National Association of State Energy Officials. We're the member organization for the governor-designated energy policy offices in each of the states and territories. And we have long worked in partnership with NARUC, and so I'm very excited to be here today to chat a little bit about EVs. Next slide. And so the REV West got started, gosh, in 2017, and it is a collaboration of the 8 Intermountain states who are working together to create a seamless EV driving experience across the Intermountain West. The participating states are Arizona, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. And back in 2017, the then governors from each of the Intermountain states signed a memorandum of understanding to launch the collaboration. One of the things that is important to note is that the states in the Intermountain West, many of the governors were motivated because they were interested in attracting EV drivers and capturing the tourism that came along with EVs, particularly when it comes to regional collaborations for electric vehicles. There are lots of different motivating factors. Some states climate, some states air, also all sorts of different goals that states are pursuing. But when the initial MOU was signed, one of the statements in the MOU itself is that the collaboration is particularly interested in promoting EV travel and tourism. Of course, there are tons of national parks in that area of the country, lots of tourists driving there, particularly from the West Coast. One thing to know is that the MOU was also updated and re-signed last December. As you all know, there was a pretty big election in 2018, new governors across the country, and 4 of the Rev West governors changed. And so the new and updated MOU was to demonstrate that the new administrations were equally committed to electric vehicles and to the collaboration. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the updates as we go on. Next slide. I wanted to go through a few of the key activities from the Rev West MOU. There's a link at the end of this presentation which takes you to a web page with the original MOU, the updated MOU, and a number of other documents that have been produced by Rev West. So you can feel free to go through those at any time. But as mentioned, the Rev West MOU was really designed to create a framework for creating an Intermountain West electric vehicle corridor. The initial MOU did identify specific interstates that the states wanted to work together to electrify. And that was something that actually in the updated MOU, the states chose to not list specific interstates, but instead just keep it open so that states could continue to work together to electrify some of the smaller corridors, arterials, etc. There are a number of activities. I won't go through all of these, but really the driving force was for the states to work together to co-invest in electric vehicle infrastructure along the key corridors, share best practices, encourage manufacturers to stock the different models within the Rev West states, identify and collaborate on funding opportunities, etc. Next slide. There's been a fair amount of progress since the MOU was signed in 2017. I know that Kathy will talk a little bit about the work of the states in the Northeast and those that follow the ZEV standard. At the time of the MOU was signed, none of the Rev West states followed the ZEV standard, or excuse me, have adopted the ZEV standard. And so there wasn't a lot of binding policy in any of the Rev West states. And so instead, many of the states are choosing to offer incentives, invest in electric vehicle infrastructure, et cetera. And so they've been working together to achieve some of those goals. Since the MOU was signed, over 90 fast charging stations have been built along those key corridors that were initially identified in the MOU. And there's been a number of other points of progress. One point on the infrastructure itself is that many of the stations have been built with funds from a Volkswagen settlement that was a programmatic and a motivating factor for many of the Rev West states. They knew that they would be getting a sizable chunk of dollars from the settlement to invest in infrastructure and thought it was a good opportunity to work with each other. One of the more tangible substantive pieces within the MOU also was for the states to develop a set of voluntary minimum standards for stations in the Intermountain West. And this was a piece that was specifically called out in the initial MOU. And I believe it was late 2018, the states released an RFI to gather some information from industry and others on what should be considered when states develop these standards. And over the course of the following year, the states spoke with experts, talked a lot internally, and then last December released the voluntary minimum standards for DC fast charging stations in the Rev West states. I will say that the key words in this are voluntary and minimum, and so these standards are not binding by any means. States have the option to adopt them and promote them in any way that they see fit. But what it does do is outline specific standards to follow for siting, safety, accessibility, interoperability, etc. Most, if not all, of the Rev West states are following these standards when they invest their dollars in charging stations and are actively promoting these standards when engaging with industry. There's also been enhanced coordination between not only between the different states, but between agencies within each of the Rev West states. And so when Rev West was launched, the governors in most states designated the state energy office to act as lead. And so for quite some time, the energy offices from the Rev West states met and decided that it was really important to reach out to their counterparts in the environment and specifically the transportation agencies. And so now the Rev West group, the Rev West lead agencies are coordinating quite closely with their state departments of transportation. One thing that I don't include in these slides is also some of the progress on the procedural side of things that has and made. The Rev West states and their lead agencies, they meet every month and they have developed a series of working groups since the collaboration started to tackle specific challenges or opportunities as they have arisen. So for example, when the voluntary minimum standards were being passed through, there was a working group to really dig into that. They also launched a DOT engagement working group, and that working group again was important not only to build relationships between agencies within the same state that are working to advance electrification, but also to figure out how to better engage the Federal Department of Transportation. One of the major issues that the Rev West states have been facing is the prohibition of charging for charge at federal rest areas. This is something that they've been working closely with FHWA on and are elevating. One of the unique features of the Intermountain states is that there are huge stretches of highway without any electric infrastructure or infrastructure period. And oftentimes the best and most economical place to place a charger is at a rest area. And so the collaboration is using these types of working groups and organizing mechanisms to better engage not only agencies within the same state, but also FHWA and others. There's also been a number of analytical pieces that have been released under the Rev West group. There was a policy baseline report that was authored by us at NASEO in service to the Rev West states to really provide the states with an understanding of what the current state of play is with electric vehicle policies in the Intermountain West. The next slide. One of the objectives in the initial MOU was also to identify and collaborate on funding opportunities. As I mentioned, the states are working with each other quite closely to share best practices and understanding how to invest funds from a Volkswagen settlement, but I've also been keeping an eye out for additional opportunities to build EV charging stations and enhance awareness. And so the Rev West states partnered with clean cities coalitions throughout the Intermountain West, led by the coalition in the state of Utah, on a project that is being called Core West. And this is, as I said, a collaborative project between the Rev West states and Clean Cities with funding from the Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office to enhance accessibility in rural and remote areas. It's a project that was awarded earlier this year and is going to take place over a 3-year period. The states are currently working with the coalitions and others on developing a needs assessment to identify barriers and opportunities for infrastructure investment and awareness activities in the Intermountain West. They'll be going into a second phase of looking at branding, marketing, as well as opportunities for installing some signage along the highways in the second year. And throughout all of this, then we'll be working to invest in infrastructure along the highways and interstates of the Intermountain West. One key piece, though, is that as states are investing in infrastructure, specifically in rural and underserved areas, and specifically in those that are leading to national parks or state parks, they'll be working in partnership with the coalitions who will be engaging in education and awareness activities, both with parks as well as with other organizations and the municipalities in the rural and underserved areas. And next slide. I think that brings me to the end of my slide deck. I know that was a really quick overview, but I've included a link to a web page that contains more information on the collaboration, and you can feel free to reach out to me at any time with a question or two on request. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Cassie. All right, Cassie.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Cassie Kinsey. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at NESCAUM, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this briefing. I've been working pretty much exclusively on transportation electrification now for almost 6 years, and it's just really exciting for me to see the growing number of utilities and utility regulators around the country and states across the country that are playing a really important role in advancing electrification of passenger cars and trucks. And I think that utilities are poised now to play an even more critical role, and I think more challenging role in the upcoming electrification of trucks and buses. So this afternoon in this presentation, I'm just going to touch briefly on a number of the multi-state transportation electrification initiatives that NESCAUM is facilitating related to both passenger cars and trucks, and also more recently to medium and heavy duty trucks and buses. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with NESCAUM, just a few words of introduction. We are an association of the air pollution control agencies of the 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey. We have been in existence for more than 50 years, and we serve as a sort of a technical and policy advisor on a whole range of air quality, climate, clean transportation issues. We have a very significant focus on transportation electrification. 7 of the 8 NESCAUM member states have adopted California's motor vehicle emission standards under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. And so we've been, coordinating with California and with other states outside of the NESCAUM group of states that have adopted California motor vehicle emission standards, for decades now. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder of the reason for our focus on transportation sector for NESCAUM's member states. The transportation sector as a whole is responsible for 42% of the state's GHG emissions on average. And that's really high compared to the national average, which is around 28 or 29%. Next slide, please. And passenger cars and trucks and buses, all of them are also the region's 2 biggest sources of NOx emissions, the nitrogen oxide emissions, which is the primary pollutant that's responsible for the persistent ground level ozone or smog, as many call it, problem along the East Coast, along a number of the states in the East Coast. Next slide, please. So the ZEV states have been working collaboratively, as I mentioned, to solve our regional air quality and climate problems for decades now. But we really stepped up our efforts on transportation electrification in 2013. That's when the governors of 8 of the ZEV states, the states that have adopted California's clean car standards, some of them East Coast states, some of them West Coast states, signed a governor's memorandum of understanding the purpose of which was to work collaboratively to advance consumer EV adoption. So the MOU directed the formation of a multi-state ZEV task force and the development and the implementation of a comprehensive multi-state ZEV action plan. So these three documents to the right side of the slide are some of the sort of key overarching products, work products that the task force, the multi-state ZEV task force, has produced from this sort of ongoing effort over the past 7 years. The first was the first ZEV action plan, which was finalized in 2014, an updated ZEV action plan for the 2018-2021 period, and a Northeast Corridor regional EV charging infrastructure strategy for the states from Virginia through Maine. And there's these documents all contain a tremendous amount of detail, many recommendations, but collectively, you know, they produce a roadmap for passenger car and light duty truck electrification. So they identify key public policies and initiatives that are needed in order to advance electrification of the light duty vehicle sector, things like purchase incentive programs, non-financial incentives like HOV lanes, very importantly, beneficial utility rate design, utility investment in charging infrastructure, consumer outreach and education, public sector fleet electrification targets. They recommend strategies for building out a reliable, what we call consumer-friendly charging network, things like open access to charging stations for drivers, charging station interoperability, something Cassie mentioned in her presentation, future-proofing of charging stations and charging infrastructure so that charging stations can be sort of modular in design and can be, you know, capacity can be increased over time as demand increases. Pricing transparency for drivers on charging stations, uptime requirements to ensure reliability of the system. Those are just a few of the issues which these documents touch on and make recommendations on. And, you know, toward that end, the task force has produced a number of white papers and best practices documents on, you know, all of these topics that are serving as templates or models for state action, you know, in terms of developing regulatory programs or policies at the state level. And so we're continuing these efforts to promote consumer adoption of EVs. Next slide, please. But this year, we have actually expanded our efforts into the medium and heavy duty sector with a new governor's memorandum of understanding that was signed by 15 states and the District of Columbia, who have committed to work collaboratively to accelerate electrification of diesel trucks and buses in their states. So we announced the MOU in July. And, you know, this MOU really kind of builds off the framework and the structure of the light duty vehicle initiative. And there's, I would say there's 4 key components of this new medium and heavy duty MOU. First, there's the commitment of the signatory jurisdictions to work collectively to foster a self-sustaining market for zero-emission trucks and buses. We set some sales goals in the MOU. Long-term 2050 goal of 100% ZEV sales of medium and heavy-duty vehicles by 2050, and then importantly, a 30% interim goal, 2030 goal for ZEV sales of trucks and buses that will help keep us on track toward meeting the long-term goal. There's a lot of emphasis in this MOU on deployment of zero-emission trucks and buses in areas and in ways that are going to bring direct benefits to disadvantaged communities. This is an important issue for the states. There are many communities of color, low-income communities, disadvantaged communities who are located near trucking corridors, near ports, near trucking centers, distribution hubs, and who are disproportionately impacted by emissions, diesel truck emissions from trucks and buses. These are the fence-line communities that you probably often hear about. And then finally, the MOU directs the existing multi-state ZEV task force, which was created for the light-duty vehicle sector, to develop and implement a medium and heavy-duty plan. So, that process is now underway. Next slide, please. So there are 15, as I mentioned, 15 states and the District of Columbia that are signatories. These are the states that have signed on to the MOU. You can see from the map, it's a geographically and politically bipartisan, sort of diverse group of both ZEV and non-ZEV states that are participating in this. This is a broader group of states than those we have previously worked with on transportation electrification initiatives. And I think it's because, you know, this particular initiative seems to have resonated with states. You know, I think in part because truck and bus electrification delivers not just climate benefits, which are obviously very important, but also air quality and public health benefits as well. So the MOU is not closed to additional state participation, and a number of states have expressed interest in joining the initiative. So this coalition could conceivably expand in the coming months. Next slide, please. So the first thing we're doing and what we're in the middle of right now is stakeholder outreach. We've launched an initial round of stakeholder outreach to these key stakeholder groups, which includes utilities. And we are establishing a stakeholder advisory council to provide early input on the action plan and help us plan some informational learning sessions for state staff on the range of sort of issues that they need to develop a deeper understanding of. And MJ Bradley and Associates, who many of you I'm sure are familiar with, will facilitate a convening of the MOU state utilities. So the utilities can provide sort of, to the extent possible, consensus input and recommendations in the action plan on issues that relate to, you know, utility engagement and utility role. Next slide, please. So once we complete the initial round of outreach, we will be turning our attention to the action plan itself. And I will say that the path to electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles is going to be much more challenging than it is with the light duty vehicle sector. The market itself is much more complex. The deployment of charging infrastructure is more challenging. Truck and bus charging requires larger batteries and more power. Load demand for trucks and buses is an order of magnitude greater. So, you know, ensuring that the grid has the capacity to meet the load demand for electrified fleets is going to be really essential to the success. Distribution system upgrades are likely to be going to be needed to support some fleets transitioning to electric vehicles. Managed charging and V2G programs are going to be needed to keep costs down and reduce the need for grid upgrades. There's a need for utility distribution system planning, fleet coordination, investment in make-ready infrastructure, beneficial rate design. All of these things are so central to the successful electrification of trucks and buses. I really can't emphasize enough the importance of utility engagement in this effort, and the importance of public utility commissions as well in overseeing these programs and approving them and making policy decisions. So the bullets on this slide, I'm not going to, you can read them, basically highlight the kinds of measures that the task force is going to be considering to address, you know, these challenges that I've mentioned, but also lots of other challenges. Next slide, please. So this is our timeline. We hope to have a draft plan for stakeholder review and input early next year, and a finalized plan by next fall. It's a very ambitious schedule. We may need to make adjustments, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. And I think that's my last slide. The last slide I have on here, I put together some resources for bus and truck electrification that really are pretty focused on utility-related issues, which I thought would be of most interest to you. So thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, happy to answer them.
Great. Thank you so much, Cassie. If people have questions, please feel free to put them in the question box, and we'll move to Brendan for the next presentation.
All right, I'm just working on getting my slides up here, and hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yep.
All right.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for your time. My name is Brendan Jordan. I work for an organization called the Great Plains Institute. We're a nonprofit organization focused on energy and climate issues, and we do a lot of convening and facilitation and consensus building, which is certainly a big part of what describes the work going on in the Midwest and Gulf Coast region that we help facilitate. I want to thank Cassie and Kathy for giving a good overview of a lot of the issues that different regions are wrestling with. Certainly a lot of the same issues are being encountered in our region as well. Want to give a quick highlight on a few, really two major regional electric vehicle projects. And one of them is called the Mid-Continent Transportation Electrification Collaborative, which is a multi-stakeholder group that includes state government, but also includes a number of other EV-related stakeholders, and also the Regional Corridor Collaborative, which kind of emerged out of MTech and is only state officials and focused on planning and executing regional EV corridor charging corridors. You can see there the states that are represented in that work, and I see some folks on this call from a few of those states. And generally, we kind of refer to the Midwest and Gulf Coast region. It's sort of an outgrowth of MISO, but also includes some non-MISO states at this point. It's expanded a bit. And this is just another way of looking at how those two work streams relate to each other. Everybody in the Regional Corridor Collaborative tends to also be an MTech, but MTech's bigger and works on more issues. And MTech's been around since 2018 and has always focused on this kind of nexus between utility regulation, utility programs, utility actions, and the transportation sector. The first work product came out in April 2018, and the stakeholders observed at that time that there were some utility EV programs coming forward in a few states, but the work had not been done necessarily to build stakeholder support and get a better understand of what the different interveners and stakeholders wanted to get out of those programs. So MTech released a set of guiding principles for utility EV program design. Those principles have broad stakeholder support and have been cited in a number of intervener comments and different proceedings related to utility EV programs. The second work product is a roadmap to transportation, to decarbonization through transportation electrification. I'll get into some of the details of this, but this involved both a lot of stakeholder input, but also a pretty extensive modeling project to look at how far we can go with transportation electrification in the region and what the impacts are for the utility system and for other regional objectives around integration of renewables and value for consumers. Third work product is a white paper on DC fast charging and demand charges and the impact that utility demand charge tariffs have on the DC fast charging business model, which has gotten a lot of use because it also comes with a calculator tool, so a utility can look at look at a utility or a fast charger operating in their service territory under their rates and see what kind of profit and loss that would encounter, just so they can see, would a project developer want to do a project in our service territory or not? And we can also get a sense of what types of tariffs work better for supporting that infrastructure. Just getting into the roadmap, first, on the left, just wanted to point out what kinds of organizations participate in this work. It is broad and multi-stakeholder, including, automakers, utilities, including investor-owned and co-ops, charging companies, nonprofit organizations, as well as some state agencies. At a high level, the modeling work showed that we can deploy very high levels of EVs in the region, and that EVs actually complement efforts to decarbonize the grid. So even though you're adding a lot more demand for electricity, we actually got more greenhouse gas reduction by adding EVs than by not doing so. And a big part of that comes down to planning, doing time of use rates and smart EV charging, and finding smart ways to make sure that EVs are charging at a time that is most beneficial to the grid. That is another issue that impacts the benefit to customers. So a lot of studies have found that EVs are good for utility customers, even utility customers that don't buy an EV and don't necessarily see the savings on fuel and maintenance. But again, if you're smart about how to integrate them, you can generate more electricity at off-peak times, get more revenue out of existing assets, and really have a net positive benefit. We also saw more savings if we can figure out some ways to avoid growth in vehicle miles driven. So all these strategies around public transportation and smart livable cities that all complements electrification. We also found that EVs don't get you all the way there. If you want to decarbonize transportation, you need some other low carbon fuel strategies as well. So EVs go a long way, but not all the way. I just put this up to show, and this is some scenarios looking out to 2050. We looked at a really wide variety of scenarios, including higher EV growth, slower EV growth, different scenarios for oil prices, and different scenarios for how quickly EVs achieve cost parity. And you do get some variability, but one of the common themes is, the rate of speed of adoption differs, but by the time you get out to 2050, except for some pretty extreme scenarios with very low oil prices, you're getting very significant adoption of battery electric vehicles at that point. And so the question really comes, what do we do in the next, sort of in the near term, to support that adoption? Utility programs have been a really big part of what has been going on in this region. And I think if you looked at 4 or 5 years ago, there was not a lot of activity in our region in terms of electric vehicle support, promotion, adoption. And today we've had just in recent years $87 million in utility EV programs approved by commissions, and we've seen nearly $200 million proposed since this January. And I'm sure that map is outdated, and probably some of you in these states are scratching your heads at what I missed, but that all this data comes from a resource called the Atlas EV Hub. And so utilities are getting involved in a lot of areas, including infrastructure, investment, fleet engagement, consumer education, and rate design issues. And of course, those of you are all regulators or supporting your regulators in your state, and so you're wrestling with all these issues as well. In terms of emerging topics for MTech, we've at a high level weighed in on the general principles and looked at how far we can go with electrification. There's some issues emerging in terms of, I think we're still seeing a lot of programs described as pilot, but we're starting to get to the point where some of these utility programs may be moving towards full scale and thinking about what that means. Deployment of medium and heavy duty is a big issue, and Kathy talked a lot about that. What can we do as a region to support medium and heavy duty vehicle adoption and infrastructure? So we're starting to analyze some of the different early use cases that might come online first, and thinking about how to support them. Beyond infrastructure, there is still a lot of stakeholder interest in creating incentives for adoption. And so what's the right way to do that at a state or regional level? And then finally, the whole issue of the EV manufacturing supply chain in a region like the Midwest, where we have a lot of automotive manufacturing, there are certainly some risks that you would see decline as the auto industry shifts towards electrification. And so the question becomes, how do we maintain leadership? How do we maintain and expand the existing jobs in manufacturing, and what kind of policy framework supports that? I mentioned a focus on electric vehicle charging. There is a major gap in our region. This is some research from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory looking out to 2030. If we wanted to get to 20% of car sales by 2030, we have a major gap, and we'll need much more investment in public DC fast charging and public and workplace level 2 charging. Even though a lot of charging will occur at home for light duty vehicles, people will not buy cars unless they have the ability to get on the road and go on a road trip. And so, you know, lack of public charging is a major barrier to adoption. Of course, you also have people who may not have a garage, may live in an apartment building, and we need to figure out how to serve those segments as well. The Regional Corridor Collaborative, which is again an outgrowth of MTech and is a partnership between state agencies, including Volkswagen settlement administrators, energy offices, and other state agencies. By the way, we would certainly, we have some involvement from regulatory agencies and would welcome more involvement if this is something you want to get more involved in. But we are taking a hard look at what the infrastructure need is for the region. You see a map here. This is showing highway corridors, traffic volumes, and existing chargers. We're going to start looking at the gaps in the network, and also, you know, not just looking at crow flies distance, but actually the actual road network using GIS analysis. And at the end of this, it'll be a fairly sophisticated analysis, not just looking at sort of, here's the map, here's traffic patterns, how do we put a charger after every 50 miles, but also looking at growth in EV adoption over time. How do you future-proof the system so that as adoption increases, you can handle higher capacity and more chargers? And so thinking about a phased implementation over time and existing coverage gaps, then we'll be able to, you know, collaborate better as a region in terms of both Volkswagen settlement investments, utility investments as they're collaborating with this through the MTech, and also where do we need more funding? How can we collaborate best as a region to attract the needed funding? About ready to wrap up. There are some documents here, all those MTech products. We also have, MTech has weighed in on federal policy through electrification to support economic recovery in the Midwest and Mid-Continent. So those are linked as well. And again, happy to include more people in this work. And if this is something you'd like to talk about, I'm easy to find. My email address is up on screen. But yeah, I'm looking forward to questions at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And we're gonna move on to Jen next. So let me pull her presentation up.
Hey, thank you, everyone. I can start while you're pulling that up. So good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm really excited to share some of the EV coordination work that's happening in the Southeast. I'm just going to keep talking until they come. There it is. So I'm going to start out by saying we are not as far along as these other regions, but we're learning from these other regions. We do have a little bit of MOU envy, but I'll talk about that in a second. But we're learning from the other regions, and there are a lot of really good things happening in the Southeast, which I'm going to share with you today. Next slide, please. Just quickly, if you don't know about the Nicholas Institute, we are part of Duke University. We are a separate research and policy-focused institution, and our mission is here. We hope to provide research and analysis to decision makers that you can make the very important decisions that you need to make on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So you all know the Southeast. This map should come as no surprise, but I did want to just talk a little bit about the Southeast. We're a large area. We have over 97 million people, 580,000 square miles, give or take. We have 18,000 miles of coastline and mountains and lakes and cultural destinations. And we're home to quite a few light, medium, and heavy duty vehicle manufacturers as well as parts manufacturers. And so, you know, there's a lot of very important reasons why the Southeast wants to be focused on electrification and electric vehicles. Tourism, rural and urban areas, economic development opportunities. Sometimes we have to think about evacuation routes, hopefully not any more this season, but all of these things come into play and is one of the reasons why it's a terrific opportunity for electric vehicles in the Southeast and for regional collaboration to get us there. Next slide, please. So while we don't have any specific Southeast region-focused collaborations right now, we do have quite a few state-focused initiatives, and I wanted to make sure that I pointed those out. In 2019, both Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama launched their own versions of an EV roadmap or ZEV plan or infrastructure plan. So our states are starting to think through what they want to do within their own states. Also in 2020, both Florida and South Carolina have kicked off their EV stakeholder processes or plan to in the next couple of months. And I expect a lot more states are going to follow in the Southeast. But in the meantime, next slide, please. We've been thinking at the Nicholas Institute and sharing with the decision makers in the Southeast the benefits to regional EV collaboration. And you can see quite a few there, all of which I believe have been mentioned by the other speakers on the call today. And the reason for that is we've taken a lot of ideas from everybody on the call, from the Rev West team, from the multi-state ZEV task force, and from the Great Lakes regions MTech, and all of the great work that's being done. So this should look very familiar, but all of these things are very important to the Southeast as well. And so we've been, since 2019, talking to a lot of different people in the Southeast about the benefits of collaborating, discussing the opportunities that there are to collaborate, and sharing best practices and ideas from all of your other regions. So all of this has been happening for about the last 2 years, and I'm happy to announce that we have 4 concurrently running collaborations occurring today. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about all of these in more detail in the next couple of slides, but here are the 4 that are occurring today, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of it because some of them are starting up more recently. The Southeast EV Information Exchange is something that's being run by state energy offices. The Southeast Regional EV Partnership is something that's being developed for academic, industry, NGOs, and utilities. The Southeast Regional EV Initiative, REVI, is something that's been under discussion in governor's offices, departments of transportation, and other state agencies. And Electrify the South is being run by some electric vehicle advocates to kind of broaden the stakeholder group. So a lot of activity, very similar sounding names, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those mean and what they're trying to accomplish. Next slide, please. So the Southeast EV Information Exchange, like I said, is being led by the Southeast State Energy Offices. They are going to kick off in October and will be facilitated by NASEO, Cassie Powers, and the Nicholas Institute, myself. It is funded by DOE state energy plans, and their goal is to share information and best practices between the states. And then they want to identify where they can collaborate over the coming months and years, looking at EV infrastructure, education and outreach, policy development, and a very keen focus on promoting EV solutions in rural and low-income communities. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Southeast has quite a few rural communities, and we have a very high poverty level. So we need to make sure that we are coming up with solutions for everyone. So that's the information exchange. Next slide, please. The Southeast Regional EV Partnership, you can see a lot of the organizations that are going to be involved there. Back in January 2020, the Georgia Tech hosted a very good electric transportation forum in Atlanta. And out of that came the recognition that we do all want to be talking together. And so we are in coordination with Georgia Tech, the Nicholas Institute is going to be pulling together this diverse group of stakeholders to discuss ways to advance EVs. So this is going to include academic groups. It'll include NGOs. You can see a few utilities on there, manufacturers. We plan to have our first meeting in October, and from there we are going to decide what are the key areas and gaps and needs that this region has that this coordinated group can get together to discuss. So it may be outreach and education, it may be equity and inclusion, it could be other initiatives that we are yet to define yet. So this group will be getting together very soon to start to map out what that process will be. Next slide, please. And then finally, like I said, we have a little bit of MOU envy, and so we have been talking for the last year or so and proposing a Southeast Regional EV Initiative MOU signed by the Southeast governors. This is not something, I should say up front, that has been signed. It is just under discussion within the Southeast states, but the idea would be very similar to what the Rev West group did and some of the other regions, is to work together to promote and enable EV adoption in the Southeast. Here we are focused on a lot of economic opportunities for the states, as well as tourism, as well as just growing the already vibrant auto manufacturing industry. And so we want to work together to make this happen in the Southeast. Now this group can include state energy offices, governor's offices, departments of transportation. We're talking to departments of commerce, and even commission staff. If all of you are interested, please let me know. We'd love to have you be a part of this team. Next slide, please. And then the final thing I'll leave you with is, like I said, there's this broader stakeholder group called Electrify the South that is being pulled together by Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. The intent of this group is to pull together individuals, communities, municipalities, policymakers, utilities, everyone that's interested in electrifying the South together to think through ways to do it. They originally had plans to have a summer meeting, but that was postponed due to COVID, and I believe they're trying to plan something for the fall. So I think this would be a really good way for anyone on the call that would want to get involved, to be involved with this effort as well. So as you can see, there is a lot of activity in the Southeast involving many different types of stakeholders, but they're all driving towards the same goal of getting more electrified transportation in the Southeast. I think that is my last slide. Yep, there I am. That's my contact information. Oh, it was. There it is. If anybody would like to get in touch. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and move into questions now. So thank you for those of you who have submitted your questions so far. And Commissioner Bocanegra, did you want to address some of, or ask some of these questions?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm going to go through a couple of questions here that were submitted, some by me and some by a few other folks. So the first question, I'll leave this open to any of our presenters, and thank you all for your presentation. The first one is, to what degree do the participants in each of your region's coordination initiatives discuss or attempt to align around who will pay for installing charging infrastructure in each state? Or is the focus more on master planning, if you will, to enable these corridors?
Well, so I'll jump in. It's Kathy Kinsey from NESCAUM. So for us, I think it's both. Definitely there's an emphasis on planning, especially in the Northeast, because we are a group of relatively small states, very close geographically. There's a ton of traffic, up and down the coast, both for work and pleasure. And so, we really need to be thinking about a consistent, charging infrastructure network that is familiar to users and is reliable and, and standard and uniform to the extent possible. But our Northeast Corridor Strategy, which is one of the documents that I mentioned, it talks about funding, and we have three now, as I think Brandon mentioned, three big sources of funding. We have the Electrify America funds, where there's a lot of funding going into the Northeast region from Electrify America. We have the utility funding. All of our states have utility programs. All of the Northeast states and really all of the ZEB states have utility programs. New York just announced a really significant funding for make-ready infrastructure, $700 million project. And so our document is focused on coordinating investments. Who should be investing where? So the strategy makes recommendations for these different investments, public and private sector investors. Where should they be investing? What kinds of investments should they be making? You know, what should the priorities be? So, you know, one of the things that we emphasize for utilities, which is happening across the country, is infrastructure investments in underserved communities, like multi-unit dwellings and urban areas where, you know, we have a lot of garage orphans, that sort of thing. And we've made recommendations to Electrify America to concentrate its funding on the DC fast charge network along the Northeast Corridor states and in the other ZEB states and steering committee members. So it's a little bit of both. Does that answer your question?
Yes, no, absolutely. Thank you. Does anybody else want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, this is Brendan Jordan with the Great Plains Institute, and in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, you know, our first step is to figure out what the need is. And by the way, we acknowledge up front, you know, we're focused on corridors and DC fast charging. That's only one area where we're going to have a need, and a lot of other areas have been articulated. You know, we're going to have to dig into those areas as well down the road. But, you know, just looking at that one area, we're going to try and figure out what the need is going forward and lay out a plan, and then figure out what level of investment will be required, and look at the levels of investment that are already in place. State Volkswagen Appendix D, you know, in the Midwest, we've really largely been bypassed by Electrify America, but we're hoping by having a plan in place, we can attract more interest from private sector and other third party and Electrify America, and you know, also kind of create kind of that sandbox for everybody to play in. We know that we're not going to be coordinating every investment, but at least we can lay out a plan that clearly identifies the need and the opportunities for collaboration where they exist, and try to create a more coordinated effort going forward.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, this question is actually from Vice Chair Stanek. I'm not sure if you want to unmute yourself, Jason, and ask it yourself if you'd like. Otherwise, I'm happy to jump in here for you.
Oh, hi, Commissioner. I was just curious regarding the second presentation. We heard a lot about fleet electrification, heavy-duty fleets, and city buses. And I was just curious. I did see that in China they have hundreds of thousands of electric buses operating, and we have just a handful in the United States. I think Baltimore has 1 or 2. New York City has 2 or 3. Do we have manufacturers in the United States that are able to supply the demand if it's forthcoming?
You know, the manufacturers, I think, are keeping up with demand. Proterra is probably the largest electric bus manufacturer in the United States. Lion is located in Canada, but also sells in the United States. And BYD, I believe, has a manufacturing facility here in the United States and is also producing buses for transit agencies in this country. So yes, I do think that as demand grows, and it is growing, an increasing number of transit agencies around the country are electrifying. I live in Frederick, Maryland, and we have 5 electric buses, and they've just ordered another 5. So, you know, I think the supply will keep up with the demand, you know, as it grows, because it's going to grow incrementally. It's not, you know, there's not going to be a hockey stick. It's just going to continue to grow, and I think it'll keep up. But that's just my non-expert opinion.
Well, that's good to hear about Frederick, Maryland. We'll have to check out the buses there. Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah, sure.
And this is Jen Weiss. I just wanted to add to what Kathy just said. Yeah, in the Southeast, there are quite a few manufacturers of buses. Proterra is there, Bluebird, Thomas built. And as I was saying, that is one of the opportunities that the Southeast sees, is to grow that industry and include all of the supplies and parts manufacturers that go with it. So definitely want to grow that and to watch the growth and continue to build on it.
Thanks, Jen, for that. So moving on to another question. This one's actually from me. And so I thought I would kind of narrow it towards commission-related efforts. And so my question for all of you is, are you guys seeing anything in terms of commissions participating in any of these efforts? There was a lot of interesting stakeholders that I guess I hadn't even thought of, you know, everything from universities to typical folks we might see in the transportation electrification ecosystem. So I'm wondering, have you guys seen anything like that in terms of regional coordination?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can take a first crack at that, Brendan, with the Great Plains Institute. When in terms of the collaboration in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, it's very multi-stakeholder, and there is some participation from regulators, but I think there could be more, and we would really welcome that. I think, you know, creating some opportunity to have awareness about what all the other sectors are doing. What are the utilities doing? What programs are getting approved? What are the state investments that are occurring? What are the different private sector initiatives? You know, I think anything we can do to better coordinate will help, because you ultimately, you know, people are driving these vehicles beyond the borders of their state or beyond the you know, service area boundaries of an individual utility. So we really do need to create regional and national networks, and that will require coordination.
This is Cassie. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's a little awkward, and you might know much better than I, but I think there's some tension there between utility regulators getting involved in the, you know, stakeholder processes. I think it's sometimes difficult, and I think from my experience, there's some reticence on the part of regulators to do that. When we, back in around the 2015-2016 timeframe, the California utilities, as many of you will recall, were really getting involved in transportation electrification in the passenger car sector. And there was really not a lot of public dialogue going on the East Coast, you know, about utility engagement and utility investment. And so we at NESCAUM facilitated 2 workshops, one for utilities, where we brought utility execs from the West Coast together with utility execs from the East Coast utilities to explore the benefits of transportation electrification and talk through issues, and created an opportunity and a forum for dialogue between the utilities. And then we followed up with a workshop for public utility commissions and staff, where we did the same thing. We had 8 states participating, staff and commissioners from 8 states in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic participating. It was a 2-day workshop. And it just really focused on, you know, benefits of transportation electrification for ratepayers and you know, grid benefits, et cetera. And, you know, all the, you know, many of the issues around transportation electrification, like rate design, infrastructure investment, that kind of thing, and an opportunity for a dialogue. And that sort of forum, you know, seemed to work really well. I mean, we had a lot of positive feedback from the staff and from commissioners who participated. So I think that's one opportunity for commissions to, you know, really get engaged in a more neutral, maybe, way.
No, that makes sense. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add that I'm not sure if Jamie Barber is still on the phone, but when we had the Electric Transportation Forum in Atlanta at the beginning of the year, Commissioner Eccles was very involved with that, and I think there were 4 or 5 other commissioners in attendance for that forum. And so that partnership really welcomes that dialogue, as Kathy was saying. I like that term, that dialogue and that conversation, and we hope to encourage that going forward.
That's great. Thank you all for chiming in. I think we have time for one more question, and it's kind of piggybacking off that first one. And you know, I completely understand. You know, perhaps like the awkwardness you mentioned with commissions getting involved, and so absent, you know, commissions getting involved. I guess my question is there anything that commissions could be doing, I guess, just to bring awareness to regional coordination versus actual participation? You know, should we be encouraging utilities to play some role? I was taking notes, and I think one of you mentioned that you know, utilities themselves have MOUs with their I guess other utilities within the same state. So do you think that that's something that could happen as far as commissions just bringing awareness or encouraging utilities?
I'll jump in, Kathy. I do think that, yes, I do. What I think, this is just one suggestion. I'm sure that that Jen and Brendan have other ideas, but you know, one idea is just to open a proceeding, you know, open a commission proceeding to just investigate the issues and the opportunities, and open a dialogue. It doesn't necessarily have to be a rate-making proceeding or something like that. It could be simply an opportunity to explore issues and think about policies and maybe work toward developing individual state policies for utilities and for, you know, engagement in transportation electrification. That's one thought.
No, thank you. That's a great idea. Let's see here. I think we're just about out of time. I'll turn it back over to Jasmine, but thank you all for answering those questions, and thank you for the presentations again.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
So
yeah, thank you.
we appreciate it. Yeah, we're